In a small, forgotten corner of town, a German shepherd lay motionless, chained tightly to a rusted post. His body was thin, his ribs sharply visible beneath his matted fur, and his hollow eyes reflected nothing but despair. Days turned into nights as he suffered in silence, his only company the empty food bowl and the dripping faucet he couldn't reach. But one day, when all hope seemed lost, everything changed. A chance encounter brought light to his darkest moment, and what happened next will restore your faith in second chances. The sun beat down mercilessly on the backyard, a barren patch of dirt surrounded by a decaying wooden fence. In the center of the yard, chained to a rusty metal post, lay Rex, a German shepherd who had long forgotten what it felt like to be loved. His fur, once thick and glossy, was now patchy and dull, clinging to his malnourished frame. His water bowl had been dry for days, and the remnants of stale dog food sat untouched in his empty food dish, a cruel reminder of the neglect he endured. Rex's owner, a man consumed by his addiction to alcohol, had no regard for the dog's suffering. The neighbors had often heard shouting from the house, the occasional crash of bottles breaking against walls, but no one had dared to intervene. And so, Rex remained in the yard, ignored and forgotten. The days blurred together as Rex lay on the ground, too weak to move. The chain around his neck had rubbed his skin raw, leaving painful open wounds. He had tried to bark for help in the beginning, but now his voice was hoarse, his energy completely drained. The only sounds he could hear were the distant laughter of children playing in the neighborhood and the occasional buzz of flies circling his emaciated body. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rex lifted his head weakly. His eyes, though dim with exhaustion, caught a faint glimmer of movement beyond the fence. A silhouette appeared, a person walking along the street. Rex let out a faint whimper, his body trembling from the effort. The figure stopped. For the first time in days, someone noticed him. The figure beyond the fence was a young woman named Emily, who had recently moved into the neighborhood. She had been out for an evening walk, hoping to explore the area and unwind after a long day. But as she passed by the broken-down house, her footsteps slowed. Something didn't feel right. At first, she thought she'd heard a faint sound, a whimper, almost too soft to notice. She stopped and looked around, her eyes scanning the overgrown yard and the dilapidated fence. That's when she saw him. Her breath caught in her throat. Rex lay in the dirt, his frail body barely visible in the fading light. The sight of his thin frame, the way his ribs jutted out sharply under his patchy fur, made her stomach turn. She could see the chain cutting into his neck, and the way he barely moved, his body limp with exhaustion. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. She stepped closer to the fence, her heart pounding. "Hey there," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you okay, boy?" Rex lifted his head weakly, his dull eyes meeting hers. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He was too weak for that. Instead, he let out a faint whimper, his tail giving the barest flicker of a wag before falling still again. Emily's heart broke. Looking around, she noticed the empty food bowl, the dry water dish, and the overall state of the yard. It was clear that no one had cared for this dog in a very long time. She glanced toward the house, the windows dark and silent, and felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Who could let this happen? She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of Rex, quickly sending it to a friend who worked at a local animal rescue organization. "I found a dog in really bad shape," she typed, her fingers trembling. "He's chained up and starving. What do I do?" Her phone buzzed moments later. "Try to get him water if you can," the reply read, "and call animal control right away. They'll know how to handle it." Emily nodded to herself, determination replacing her initial shock. She hurried back to her house, grabbing a bottle of water and an old bowl from her kitchen. As she returned to Rex, she kept her movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to scare him. "It's okay," she said softly as she poured the water into the bowl and slid it under the fence. "I'm not going to hurt you." Rex sniffed the water cautiously before lowering his head to drink. Emily watched as he lapped at it slowly, his movements weak but desperate. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized just how close to death he must have been. "You're so strong," she whispered. "We're going to get you out of here. I promise." As Rex drank, Emily pulled out her phone and dialed the local animal control office. The operator listened patiently as she explained the situation, her voice shaking with urgency. I don't think he has much time, she said, glancing back at Rex. Please hurry. We'll send someone right away, the operator assured her. Hanging up, Emily knelt by the fence, her hand reaching through one of the gaps to stroke Rex's head gently. He flinched at first, but as her touch remained soft and steady, he relaxed slightly, his eyes closing as if he was finally allowing himself to trust someone. Minutes felt like hours as Emily waited for help to arrive. She stayed by Rex's side the entire time, speaking to him softly, her voice filled with reassurance. You're not alone anymore, she told him. I'm going to make sure you're okay. When the sound of a truck pulling up broke the quiet, Emily turned to see an animal control officer stepping out, carrying a bolt cutter and a gentle expression. The man approached the fence, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the sight of Rex. He's in rough shape, the officer said grimly, but we'll get him out. Emily watched as the officer cut through the chain holding Rex to the post. The dog didn't resist. He was too weak to even stand. Carefully, the officer scooped him into his arms, cradling him like a child. Thank you for calling, the officer said to Emily as he carried Rex toward the truck. You might have just saved his life. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she watched them go. Take good care of him, she said quietly. As the truck disappeared down the street, Emily stood there for a long moment, staring at the now empty yard. She didn't know what would happen to Rex, but she knew one thing for certain. She had done the right thing. Rex's body trembled in the back of the animal control truck as the officer drove carefully toward the rescue shelter. The warmth of the vehicle contrasted sharply with the cold, desolate backyard where he had spent so many nights. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rex was no longer chained. The officer glanced back at him occasionally through the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. You're a tough one, the man muttered to himself. We'll get you the help you need. When they arrived at the shelter, the staff was already prepared. Emily had called ahead after the truck left, explaining Rex's dire condition. The team wasted no time, gently lifting him onto a soft blanket and carrying him into the building. The fluorescent lights of the examination room revealed the full extent of his neglect. His ribs protruded sharply from his sides, and his neck bore deep, raw wounds from the chain that had kept him captive for so long. His fur was patchy, matted, and caked with dirt, and his eyes were dull, as though life had been drained from them. The shelter veterinarian, Dr. Carter, knelt beside him, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. Poor boy, she murmured, running her hands carefully over his frail body. You've been through so much. Rex whimpered softly, too weak to resist as Dr. Carter and her team began their work. They cleaned his wounds, started him on fluids to combat dehydration, and administered medication to help with the infection that had spread around his neck. As they worked, Rex occasionally opened his eyes, glancing around the room with an expression of cautious hope. For the shelter staff, it was clear that Rex's journey would not be an easy one. He was malnourished, injured, and emotionally scarred. But despite his frailty, there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Meanwhile, back at her house, Emily couldn't stop thinking about Rex. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the image of him chained in that barren yard. The thought of him suffering in silence for so long made her chest tighten. Finally, as the first rays of morning light filtered through her curtains, she made a decision. She would visit him. When Emily arrived at the shelter later that morning, the staff greeted her warmly. You're here for the German Shepherd, aren't you? One of the volunteers asked. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. How is he? The volunteer's expression softened. He's stable for now, but he's got a long road ahead of him. They led Emily to a quiet room where Rex lay on a soft bed, his body wrapped in a blanket. An IV drip was attached to his front leg, and his breathing, though still shallow, was steadier than it had been the day before. When Emily stepped inside, his ears twitched slightly at the sound of her footsteps. Hey, buddy, she said softly, kneeling beside him. It's me. Rex opened his eyes, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure if he recognized her. But then, his tail gave the faintest wag, a small, almost imperceptible movement that brought tears to her eyes. You remember me, she whispered, reaching out to gently stroke his head. "You're so brave. You know that." The staff had warned Emily not to expect much interaction. Rex was still too weak to do much more than rest. But as she sat with him, speaking to him softly, she could see a flicker of trust beginning to form. He didn't flinch when she touched him, didn't turn away from her voice. Instead, he simply lay there, his tired eyes following her movements. For the next hour, Emily stayed by his side, telling him about her own dog from childhood and the quiet little neighborhood where she lived. She promised him that he would never have to feel alone again, that he would know what it meant to be loved and cared for. And though Rex couldn't respond, the slight wag of his tail and the way his body seemed to relax told her that he understood. When it was time for her to leave, Emily hesitated by the door, glancing back at Rex. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her voice firm. "You're not alone anymore." As she left the shelter, a sense of purpose settled over her. Rex's recovery wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to see it through. She had found him at his lowest point, and now she was going to make sure he found his way back to a life filled with love and hope. Over the next few weeks, Rex's transformation was slow but steady. The shelter staff worked tirelessly to help him regain his strength, feeding him small, nutrient-rich meals, and keeping him warm and comfortable. His wounds began to heal, though faint scars remained around his neck, where the chain had bitten into his skin. His fur, patchy and dull when he first arrived, began to grow back, soft and shiny in places. But while Rex's body was healing, his heart remained guarded. Every time someone entered his room, he would stiffen, his eyes wide and wary. He didn't bark or growl. He didn't have the energy for that, but his posture made it clear that trust would take time. The shelter staff understood this and gave him space, careful not to push him too far too fast, except for Emily. Emily visited Rex every day, rain or shine. She would sit by his bed, speaking to him softly, her voice calm and reassuring. At first, Rex barely acknowledged her presence. He would keep his eyes on the floor or turn his head away, his body tense. But Emily was patient. She didn't try to force interaction, letting him come to her on his own terms. "You've been through so much," she would say, her voice filled with compassion. "But you're safe now. I promise." One morning, as Emily sat in her usual spot beside Rex's bed, something remarkable happened. She had been reading aloud from a book, her voice steady and soothing, when she felt a gentle pressure against her leg. Glancing down, she saw Rex's nose resting lightly against her knee. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Rex was seeking her comfort. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she reached out to stroke his head. For the first time, Rex didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if he was finally allowing himself to relax. It was a small moment, but for Emily, it was everything. She knew how hard it must have been for Rex to lower his guard, even for a second. And for Rex, it marked the beginning of something he hadn't felt in a long time: trust. As the days passed, Rex began to show more signs of progress. He would wag his tail faintly when Emily entered the room, his eyes brightening at the sound of her voice. He started to eat with more enthusiasm, his body slowly filling out as the weeks went by. The once fragile dog who had been too weak to stand was now able to take short walks around the shelter, his steps unsteady but determined. Emily was always by his side during these walks, holding the leash gently as Rex explored his surroundings. She celebrated every small milestone, from the first time he sniffed a patch of grass to the moment he wagged his tail at another dog passing by. "You're so brave," she would tell him, her voice filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you." The shelter staff marveled at the bond forming between Emily and Rex. "He's a completely different dog when she's around," one of the volunteers remarked to Dr. Carter one afternoon. "It's like she's his anchor." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression thoughtful. Dogs like Rex need more than just food and medicine to heal. They need love, and Emily's giving him exactly that. One evening, as Emily sat beside Rex's bed, she found herself thinking about his future. He had come so far, but she knew his journey wasn't over. The shelter had begun discussing adoption plans for Rex, and while there had been a few inquiries, none of them felt right to Emily. "He deserves the best," she murmured, her hand resting gently on his back. someone who understands him, who won't give up on him. Rex lifted his head at the sound of her voice, his eyes meeting hers. In that moment, Emily felt a surge of clarity. She realized that the person Rex needed, the person who truly understood him, had been right in front of him all along. "I'm not going to let you go," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're coming home with me." Rex's tail thumped softly against the bed, as if he understood her words. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to imagine a future with Rex, a future where he would never have to feel abandoned or unloved again. The day Emily brought Rex home was one of quiet excitement. She had spent the week preparing her small house for his arrival, ensuring every detail was perfect. A new bed sat in the corner of her living room, soft and inviting, along with bowls for food and water neatly placed on a mat near the kitchen. A few toys, including a plush bone and a squeaky ball, rested nearby, though Emily wasn't sure if Rex would even know what to do with them yet. The car ride from the shelter to Emily's home was calm. Rex sat in the back seat, his body still thin but visibly healthier than the day she had found him. His coat had started to regain its shine, and though the scars around his neck were still faintly visible, they were no longer raw. Emily glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with pride. "We're almost there, buddy," she said, her voice gentle. "This is your new home." When they arrived, Emily opened the car door and helped Rex out. He hesitated at first, his paws pressing lightly against the gravel driveway as he looked around. Emily gave him time, holding the leash loosely and letting him adjust to the new surroundings. The soft spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers, and the distant sound of birds chirping filled the quiet. "You're safe now," Emily said softly, crouching beside him. "Let's go inside." Inside the house, Rex's cautious steps echoed on the hardwood floors as he explored. His nose twitched as he sniffed every corner, his ears swiveling at the faint creak of a floorboard. Emily stayed close, watching him carefully but giving him space to settle in. When he reached the dog bed in the living room, he paused, sniffing it tentatively before stepping onto it. His movements were slow, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure it was really meant for him. "That's yours," Emily said with a smile, kneeling beside him. "All of this is yours." Rex lowered himself onto the bed, his body relaxing slightly as he let out a soft sigh. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she watched him. It was the first time she had seen him look truly comfortable. Over the next few days, Rex began to adjust to his new life. He followed Emily everywhere, his eyes always watching her as if to make sure she wasn't going to leave him. She worked from home most days, her laptop set up on the kitchen table, and Rex would lie at her feet, his presence a quiet reminder of the bond they had formed. Emily took him on short walks around the neighborhood, letting him explore at his own pace. The first time they encountered another dog, Rex froze, his body tense. Emily knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to be afraid." The other dog passed without incident, and Rex relaxed, his tail giving a faint wag. Emily smiled, knowing it was a small victory, but an important one. One evening, as Emily sat on the couch reading, Rex surprised her. He had been lying on his bed, his head resting on his paws, when he stood and walked over to her. Emily glanced up, startled by the movement, and set her book aside. "What's up, buddy?" she asked. Rex hesitated for a moment before placing his head gently on her lap. Emily froze, her heart swelling as she realized what he was doing. Slowly, she reached out and stroked his head, her fingers running through his soft fur. "You're such a good boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you." Rex closed his eyes, his body relaxing completely as he leaned into her touch. For Emily, it was the moment she had been waiting for, a sign that Rex had truly begun to trust her, to feel safe in his new home. Over the next few weeks, Rex's personality began to shine through. He wagged his tail more often, greeted Emily with excitement when she came home from errands, and even started playing with the toys she had bought for him. The plush bone quickly became his favorite, and Emily couldn't help but laugh as he carried it around the house like a prized possession. One afternoon, as they sat together in the backyard, Emily watched Rex chase a butterfly that had landed on a patch of flowers. His movements were clumsy, but his joy was unmistakable. For the first time, he looked like a carefree dog, a dog who had finally found his place in the world. "You've come so far," Emily said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I hope you know how much you're loved." Rex trotted back to her, the plush bone now clamped in his jaws, and placed it at her feet. Emily laughed, reaching down to ruffle his fur. "You're the best boy," she said. "The absolute best." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the yard, Emily realized just how much Rex had changed her life. She had set out to save him, but in so many ways, he had saved her too. Together, they had found something neither of them had expected, a second chance at happiness. It had been 6 months since Emily first found Rex chained and forgotten in that barren yard. Now, as summer settled into her little neighborhood, the transformation in Rex was nothing short of miraculous. The once frail and fearful German Shepherd had become a picture of health and happiness, his coat thick and glossy, his body strong and confident. But it wasn't just his physical transformation that amazed Emily. It was the light that had returned to his eyes, the way he carried himself as though he finally knew he was loved. One sunny morning, Emily decided it was time to celebrate Rex's new life. She planned a day at the park, a wide, open space with trails, shaded picnic areas, and even a small lake where dogs could play. She packed a bag with water, snacks, and Rex's favorite plush bone, her excitement mirroring that of a child planning a special outing. When they arrived at the park, Rex's tail wagged furiously as he stepped out of the car. His ears perked up, and his nose twitched as he took in the scents of grass, trees, and the faint, distant smell of other dogs. Emily smiled as she clipped his leash on, giving him a reassuring pat. "You're going to love this," she said, leading him toward one of the trails. As they walked through the park, Emily marveled at how far Rex had come. He greeted other dogs with a friendly wag of his tail, no longer shrinking back in fear. He stopped to sniff every flower, his curiosity endless, and occasionally glanced back at Emily, his eyes filled with trust. When they reached the lake, Emily unhooked his leash, her heart swelling as she watched him trot toward the water. He stopped at the edge, dipping a paw into the cool water before wading in. For a moment, she held her breath, remembering how water had once been a source of trauma for him. But as Rex splashed and played, his tail wagging with joy, Emily realized that he had conquered yet another fear. "You're amazing," she called out, her voice filled with pride. "Absolutely amazing." Rex turned toward her, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. He bounded back to her, droplets of water flying off his coat, and dropped the plush bone at her feet. Emily laughed, kneeling down to hug him tightly. "You've come so far, buddy. I hope you know how proud I am of you." As the day went on, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey they had taken together. Rex had come into her life at a time when she hadn't even realized how much she needed him. She had always considered herself an animal lover, but what she felt for Rex went beyond that. He was more than a pet, he was family. When they returned home that evening, Rex settled onto his bed by the fireplace, the plush bone tucked under his paw. Emily sat on the couch, watching him as the glow of the fire flickered softly in the background. She thought back to the first time she had seen him, chained and broken, and marveled at the resilience that had carried him through everything he had endured. "You're a miracle," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've taught me so much about love and hope. I don't know what I'd do without you." Rex lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, it was as if he understood every word. He let out a contented sigh, lowering his head back onto the bed, and Emily smiled. In the months that followed, Rex continued to thrive, becoming a symbol of hope not just for Emily, but for everyone who knew his story. Emily shared his journey with the shelter and the community, inspiring others to open their hearts to animals in need. People often stopped her on walks to ask about Rex, marveling at his transformation and the bond he shared with her. For Emily, Rex was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always the possibility of light. He had taught her that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that second chances could change everything. As the seasons changed once again, Emily and Rex settled into their routine, their lives intertwined in a way that neither of them could have predicted. And though their story had begun with pain and suffering, it had become something far more beautiful, a story of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog. In the quiet of her home, as Rex lay peacefully by her side, Emily felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had set out to save him, but in the end, he had saved her too. Rex's journey from a life of neglect to one filled with love and safety reminds us all of the power of second chances. His story is a testament to resilience, hope, and the unbreakable bond that forms when someone refuses to give up on another. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who believe in the power of love and compassion. Together, we can inspire more incredible stories like this one.